So next up we have Mencius. Mencius follows fast on the heels of Mozi. Mozi was late 5th century BC. Now we're moving into the 4th century. Mencius really dominates the 4th century, and he's its central figure. Now what we're going to talk about with Mencius is the way I like to put it is that most people, when they're thinking of what they know about Confucianism, it's actually Mencius's interpretation and elaboration of the Analects that they're thinking about. Most people think they're talking about Confucius, when in fact they're talking about Mencius's interpretation and how he expanded and added that flesh, that meat to the bones, the Confucian bones that we saw in the Analects. What Mencius is going to do is he's going to borrow a lot of the elements of Mozi and use that to sort of rehabilitate Confucianism and give it a lot of the narrative, logical substance that it didn't yet have with Confucius's Analects. And in the process, he will repopularize and defend these ideas of ritual and filial piety, as we're going to see in some of the examples that we're going to give. Remember, it was Mencius who's growing up in the aftermath of Mozi's popularity, Mozi's universal love and whatnot. And Mencius said, hey, the words of Mozi are on everyone's lips. I need to respond to this. I need to sort of rescue Confucianism from Mozi's attacks. So Mencius is also, a little bit later, he's now firmly in the Warring States era. Again, widespread warfare, exploitation of the people. It was Mozi who first said that a virtuous ruler should be judged on how he treats the people, that he's doing this in their interest, not just for him and claiming the mandate of heaven. He got that idea from Mozi, and now it's ever more important because there is so much widespread human suffering of the masses during the Warring States era. One of the things that Mencius would be so famous for is reaffirming that human nature is good. He's very famous for this. Most people, if they know nothing about Mencius except for one thing, it's that he said human nature is good. He wanted to make sure people believed that we weren't evil at heart, because that was something that could be forgotten in the midst of the Warring States era, is that maybe we're really, quite evil at heart and inclined to do bad things. No, Mencius has a very positive outlook. Okay, it's one reason why he's going to be very attractive to later Chinese empires and dynasties, and they're going to institutionalize Mencius's interpretation and expansion of Confucius. It will be Mencius later on who will become the basis of the civil service examination system, which really takes off around 1000 AD or so. It's his text, his interpretations of Confucius that'll really be the basis of what everyone is studying. So you can see that his popularity later on, he has made himself quite amenable to people in power. Most states in power usually aren't going to get a whole lot of currency, a whole lot of mileage out of saying we're all evil and our job is to restrain your evilness, restrain the worst impulses of humankind. No, Mencius gives states exactly what they want. Reaffirms filial piety. Everyone knows their place in deference to their superiors, knows how to act. It's a political act by being a filial brother. I am in government, essentially. Remember, Confucius said that. That's very attractive to governments. And it's also very attractive to have a positive takeaway message. You're good. You're good. And it's up to your betters to bring that goodness out of you. And that's essentially what Mencius's message is going to be. And when the Jesuits started to first come to China in the late Ming Dynasty, 16th century, 17th century, they looked around and they said, who is most influential in the ideological canon of China? And they said, this guy named Kongzi and this guy named Mozi appear to be the most influential. And so they said, we're going to give them Latinized names. And that's why Confucius and Mencius are the Latinized versions of Kongzi and Mozi. Now, what is Mencius going to do? How is he going to rescue this? Well, like I said, he has to respond to Mozi, not just the content of Mozi, the challenge to filial piety, but also the method of arguing. Remember, we didn't see a cohesive narrative text that pursues arguments by way of logic. We did not see that in Confucius's Analects. We did begin to see that with Mozi. Mencius is going to borrow that tactic. It's very effective, and he's going to produce what we might refer to as the emotionally logical anecdote. Almost kind of contradictory, right? Emotional and logical. But he's going to get you. He's going to draw you in with emotion. Little stories, little anecdotes It's a cohesive story from start to finish. It's filled with little stories and vignettes like this, in which you've got a clear narrative progression, and then he uses the emotional takeaway of his approach to argue in favor of his point. So we can see a lot of things being borrowed here from Mozi. The literary narrative, the use of logic and evidence to make a point, but he's going to bring in these emotionally powerful anecdotes. Remember, Mozi wasn't very emotionally powerful. Talking about a little bit of black is black, but a lot of black is white, against offensive warfare and whatnot. Mencius is all about the emotionally powerful anecdote. You are good. Human nature is good. You just need someone who is able to bring it out. Sort of like a life coach, essentially, is what Mencius is trying to be. And that's actually how I kind of like to see him, is this as a life coach. I know how to bring your goodness out of you. But this goodness, the best way to do it is by practicing filial piety, knowing your place, practicing correct rituals. So let's start. I want to present a couple of these emotionally powerful anecdotes that sort of proceed by way of emotional logic to give you an idea of what he's most famous for. Two that Mencius is very famous for: the Parable of the Boy in the Well and the Parable of King Hui and the Ox. These are the two stories. If you remember nothing else about Mencius, remember these emotionally powerful anecdotes by which he uses this to draw you in and convince you that human nature is good. You just need him to bring that goodness out of you. All right, Parable of the Boy in the Well. Basically, he says that, one day someone is walking along the road and he sees a little child about to fall into a well. And he says that the guy walking past cannot help himself. He's going to see a little child about to fall into a well. He will immediately rush over. His first impulse is to rush over and save the child. All right? He can't help himself. That's like ingrained instinct. That's a good act that shows that we are good. Now, it's possible that after you start to run over to save the child, you might look at it and say, hey, I recognize that kid. That's that little punk who throws rocks at my house, or who yells at me, or, he's very loud and keeps me up at night. That's my neighbor. I can't stand that kid. I'm not going to help him out. Let that little, guy fall down the well. All right, maybe that's the reaction. That doesn't matter. He says, in the beginning, you couldn't help yourself. Your first impulse, no matter what, was to do good. You will run over and help that kid. Even if later on, you're more, the part of you that is more cynical and more calculating will change your calculus. You're just overcoming and suppressing your goodness. But that goodness came out ever so briefly. So he says there's a difference between not doing something and being incapable of doing something. All right, we are, you choose not to rescue that child, but you're not incapable of it. Okay, so you can see sort of here a couple things involved. He's getting you with logic. There is logic here. He's trying to convince you, and most people are convinced. Oh yeah, if I was doing that, I would go rescue a child. Even a serial killer would do that. They're walking along, they would still probably, for a few seconds at least, they'd want to save that kid. So I'm on board now. He's got me with his logic. Okay. But it's also a heartwarming tale about helping out the little man. Okay? That's Mozi's populism. That's that universal love sort of in there, right? Helping all other people, not just being partial to your own family. So Mencius is kind of borrowing Mozi's universal love concept here, but applying it to the king and his supposed universal love for his people. That's what's going to make you virtuous, is caring about your people. All right, and I can help bring this goodness out of you. You may suppress that goodness, but it's there. And my parable about the boy in the well proves that the goodness is there. Then he has the parable about King Hui and the ox. That's another one. And sort of the lesson here is what we might think of, scholars refer to it as command moralism. All right, the idea is that humans are basically lazy. We're good, but we're lazy, and we're easily led astray. You need an advisor like me to bring out your inner goodness. His message is essentially, Nike's message. Just do it. People don't realize that Nike essentially plagiarized their motto from Mencius 2,000 years earlier. Scholars have a more lofty name for it: command moralism. You can just do it, but you need a coach like me to help you realize your inner goodness. All right, what's the example here? Mencius hears about a king, King Hui, and he goes and meets this king and says, I heard, the grapevine says that you were putting in motion a sacrifice, a ritual that involved sacrificing an ox. And as the ox was being led to its sacrifice, its death, you saw it from a distance and said, "Oh, filled with compassion for the ox." And you couldn't bear to see the ox sacrificed. So you said, substitute a sheep for the ox. Mencius says, I heard all of this stuff. People are talking about this. But the ritual must go on. But you substituted a less valuable animal for it, because you couldn't bear to see the ox die. Apparently he doesn't care about whether or not the sheep actually dies, but the ox really affects him. And he says, then I heard that the ignorant people, your subjects, mourned the loss of the ox. They said, hey, what are you doing? You're messing up the ritual. If we don't show the gods that we're willing to sacrifice a valuable animal like an ox, the gods are going to be angered and we're going to get flooded next year. Something like that. And he says, the people were very upset. And they said, hey, you can't mess up the ritual. The ritual is important, right? And Mencius says, I understand what's going on here. You have goodness inside. You have goodness. You couldn't bear to see suffering, even for an animal like an ox. It says, this proves that you have inner goodness. You just don't act on it. You're too lazy. He doesn't tell him he's lazy to his face. But he says, essentially, you need someone like me who can bring that goodness out of you. Okay? Now, this goodness is going to be utilized in service to Confucian ideas about what constitutes a virtue. Filial piety. Practicing the correct rituals that are involved in substantiating, in harnessing filial piety in our daily lives. And he also takes this approach. How is he going to sort of put meat on the bones of Confucian filial piety? Well, one of the things Mencius talks about a lot is known as the rectification of names. ZHENGMING in modern day Chinese pronunciation. The rectification of names. Right? This is the idea that the social hierarchy is justified. Remember that pyramid structure, filial piety at every single stage? That's good, and that's the way the world's supposed to be. Not universal love, this nonsense. That's not going to work. That's unnatural. I said that's unnatural what Mozi is talking about. It's natural to care more about our closer kin than distant people. Okay? Mozi is unnatural. So filial piety is natural, he says. Right? However, it only works if everyone truly embodies their position. A father has to really have the responsibilities and act like a father. It's not just a role you get and you sit around and be lazy and beat your kids and do nothing else. You have to really be a responsible person in authority and act like a good father should. The emperor has to act like an emperor. Mothers' wives have to act like mothers and wives. Everyone has important jobs and positions in the world. You need to know your place and do your job well. And then the world will be harmonious. Right? This is the rectification of names. Names should align with what you actually do. If you are father, then you have to act like a father. If you don't act like a father, you're not really a father. And the whole system, the whole house of cards of filial piety comes crashing down. And at one point, Mencius has a conversation in which someone is saying, I heard of the execution of King Zhou at the end of a dynasty. The king was executed. How is this okay? Is it possible? Can we execute a king? And here's Mencius's famous response. He says, quote, I have heard of the execution of outcast Zhou. I have not heard of the execution of King Zhou. What's Mencius doing here? He's playing with words. He's saying that because King Zhou stopped acting like a king, truly embodying the responsibilities of a king, looking after the people. He's borrowing this from Mozi, right? Populism, caring about the people, all right? Realizing his inner goodness. Because he didn't act like a king, he lost the title. He's not a king anymore. He's outcast Zhou, not King Zhou. That's the rectification of names. It goes directly to the sense of filial piety, everyone knowing their place, their roles, and fulfilling those roles. And if you do fulfill them, if you have someone like Mencius to teach everyone what your roles are and what you're supposed to do and the proper rituals, the world's going to be great. But if you don't, then the whole system falls apart and is upended. You can also see some subversiveness here to Mencius, right? There's some subversiveness. If a king is not a king, if an emperor is not an emperor, if they don't do their duty, it can be justified to overthrow them. A little bit of subversiveness there. All right. However, if we all truly embody our positions in life, then we deserve the comforts and perks of that position. People in positions of high authority deserve the perks of that authority. A king who's really a king and looks after all of his people, he deserves to have a banquet every night. He deserves to have 10 women in his harem and live in a nice castle. So long as all of his subjects, also all men, are able to have wives, are able to afford wives, are able to eat every night, and are not cold in the winter. as long as you've looked after them, then you too, as a king, deserve to have a nice, comfortable, luxurious life as well. You've earned it, because that's a very important job. So you can see the direction we're going here. Each one of these philosophers builds on the arguments and tactics and ideas of the other, but then tweaks it a little bit. Mencius is clearly borrowing a lot from Mozi, but doing it in service to Confucius and the sort of threadbare, cryptic, disconnected ideas that we saw in the Analects. Now Confucianism is whole. It's a literary text. It's an argument. It has evidence, and it pulls you in with the emotionally powerful anecdote of Mencius. Next up, we're going to talk about a philosopher who wants to throw all the other philosophers into the dustbin and say they've all been leading you astray. You don't realize that the very nature of reality itself is manipulating you. I'm going to free you from being confined to this world. That's going to be Zhuangzi. That's going to be Zhuangzi who's up next.